So I chose to do my presentation on games and education, otherwise known as game-based education or game-based learning. Game-based learning is defined as a type of gameplay that has defined learning outcomes. Generally, game-based learning is designed to balance subject matter with gameplay and the ability of the player to retain and apply said subject matter to the real world. So in other words, or more simpler terms, it basically combines traditional education with interesting yet academic games for students in the classroom. The history of game-based education can actually be dated back to the Middle Ages and Renaissance time periods. They actually played chess with their students, or the men going off to war to teach them strategies for the war. But it wasn't until the mid 20th century that the research actually began. One of the conclusions of the research states that a virtue of gaming that is sometimes overlooked by those seeking grander goals is its unparalleled advantages in training and educational programs. A game can easily be made fascinating enough to put over the dullest facts. So after this research was conducted in the 1980s is when they started really creating digital games, which is super popular and relevant to today's society and culture. And we're seeing a growth in that for sure. So I've pasted a link to more about the history of game-based education if that interests you. I'm not requiring you to read it for the purpose of this lesson, but like I said, if that does interest you, if you want to know more about it, instituteofplay.org definitely goes into more detail about that, and I'll paste that into the final document as well for you to go look at. So the benefits of game-based education, there are several that they have found through the research. Number one, it increases enthusiasm in the classroom, which is really not surprising. It's not an unknown fact that students love games and are interested in games a lot more than they might be interested in sitting and listening to a lecture or doing something on a paper or whatnot. Something that was surprising to me, though, was that some have reported that it is cost effective for their classroom. This differs based on like where you are and what materials and what games you are trying to buy for your classroom, but it has the potential to be cheaper than textbooks or other activities that you might do in your class. Number three, it has a low physical risk or liability. I've learned a lot about this in my physical education methods course this year. You can get into a lot of trouble as a teacher with physical risks and liability issues, so it's good to have this option that doesn't have a lot of that. It's also highly engaging. It keeps the students interested and engaged in their learning. It's based on the student's pace individually, so you're not having to control a bunch of different varying paces for 20 to 30 students within the same activity and classroom and environment and whatnot, which can often be hard for a teacher. Another thing that can be hard for a teacher to do is give immediate feedback, which these games have the opportunity to do for you, which is super beneficial for the student and won't delay their learning. It's also super applicable to real life and can be easily transferred to those real life situations. Along with benefits, it fits very well into the ISTE standards for teachers. I would argue that it can be related to all five of the standards, and for students, it can be related to several of them that I have listed. So this is just a recap, but I'll give you a minute or so to look over these and read them and see how they relate to games and education. Okay, so along with the benefits and the standards that I provided, of course, there have been some disadvantages found in the research as well. Number one, it decreases student attention span according to some, which is not surprising. I mean, oftentimes in real life situations, students will need to pay close attention to lectures or focus on something that this might not provide them the opportunity to focus on and practice focusing on. It also, in contrast to when I listed it as a benefit, has the potential to be expensive, according to some researchers. This is not surprising. It really depends on what games you pick out and what you're trying to do within your classroom. It varies, but it definitely does have the potential to be expensive. Number three, a big one, is assessments. So it's super easily assessed within the game. A lot of times the game will do that for you, but that's not always super transferable to objectives and standards within your classroom curriculum, and that can provide or that can create a barrier to some teachers to have to do that on their own, and it can be really hard to connect in some situations. And lastly, it can also be hard for teachers to prioritize the time and logistics that come along with these games, especially since they're a new and growing development. Teachers may have to spend a lot more time organizing the logistics of these than they would just a traditional classroom activity or traditional classroom learning style. So one of the big questions is it effective? I've alluded to the research, but the research shows, this specific research shows that 81% of people report that scores have increased using these games. 84% have reported that student satisfaction within the classroom has increased, and 73% have reported that students are retaining more content through these games. The only negative thing that the research found through this source was the complaints about the cost, which, like I said, this is the third time I've brought this up. However, only 38% of people reported that these costs were getting in the way of the education. So even though that's a pretty high number, it's not an overwhelming number that can't be overcome in the future when using these games. And lastly, for the future of education, what does this mean for the future of education? In this course, we've previously talked about the shift from sage on the stage to guide on the side as the role of teacher in the classroom, and we wrote papers on those, so we're very familiar with it. It's definitely prevalent in today's society, and digital media and games and all of that is super growing and on the rise. But however, it's really in the hands of the teacher and what kind of teacher you plan to be. I gave you an evaluation of the advantages and the disadvantages. There's several research studies out there that I'll provide links for where you can read more about that. But like I said, it's just you evaluating it and choosing the extent to which you want to use these games in your classroom. It's super important to keep in mind the different learning styles of your students, in my opinion. I personally am not a digital learner or really considered to be a game-based learner, I don't think, but I definitely plan on using some of this education in my classroom, for I know that my students might learn better this way and stay more enthusiastic this way and engaged in their learning. And if not all of them, a lot of them will. So I definitely plan to use it while being a combination of a sage on the stage and a guide on the side. So for your assignment today, I want you to explore nationalgeographic.org. I'll provide the link in the document after. But National Geographic is a really common site and a really common, just common organization that has provided several game-based or education-based games on their site. I want you, if you are an education major and math science emphasis to explore something from the science engineering section, which I have a picture of here, and explore those games and have fun with them. I had a lot of fun with them. If you're a literature diversity emphasis, I want you to choose one from the vocabulary section, which is further down on the page, and explore those and have fun with those. And if you're not an education major, then just choose from whichever section interests you best. After you explore them and play with them, I want you to choose one to tell me about and write about. Tell me which one you played and if you liked it and if you learned from it and just how your experience went. But I'll provide those instructions in the document, and that concludes the lesson for today. Thanks for listening.